Hi, everyone. I'm Roseanne Tung. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform. And Annenberg's mission is to develop and promote educational systems that provide equitable opportunities and high-quality learning experiences for each child. We do that work by supporting districts in their capacity building, by supporting community organizing, and through communications and research and policy. Our partner in this event is the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. CSREA's vision is to consider ways in which race and ethnicity affects us as a society, and to advance that work through expert insight, sophisticated ideas, and accessible language. CSREA aims to build community among scholars and students working on race and ethnicity, and to be an interdisciplinary hub of both knowledge and public service. I also want to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, the Sarah Doyle Women's Center, the Science Center, the Graduate School, and the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. So I'm excited to have Dr. Mia Ong with us at Brown and to hear her lecture about strategies for persistence for women of color in STEM. Part of my interest in Dr. Ong's work is personal. I'm a STEM veteran, one of those women of color who chose not to stay in biomedical science after completing my doctorate. Now I don't feel like a failure, but back then I certainly did. During my 10 years in molecular and cell biology, I experienced numerous potholes that I did not know how to navigate at the time. These span the spectrum, from constantly feeling inferior and invisible in an ego-driven publish-or-perish, round-the-clock culture of my program, to blatantly inappropriate behavior from male professors during retreats and conferences. I want to be clear, I left science due to a lack of passion for the questions, not due to the potholes, and it was the right decision for me. It's now been 20 years since I earned my doctorate, and the faculty in the program from which I graduated is 1/4 women, and of those, only 1/4 are women of color, despite the fact that half of students have been women all of this time. So I'm looking forward to hearing stories of success, to hearing about Counterspaces, Microaggressions, and to hear about how to foster broader participation. Dr. Ong has conducted empirical research and evaluations focusing on women of color in STEM for 20 years. Dr. Ong's work has appeared in reports to U.S. Congress, to the Supreme Court, in journals such as Social Problems and Harvard Educational Review, and she was an invited speaker at a recent White House meeting on inclusive education in STEM. She directed an undergraduate physics program for minorities and women at UC Berkeley, where she earned her doctorate. For this work, she was a co-recipient of a Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Math, and Engineering Mentoring. Dr. Ong also serves on numerous national advisory committees, all focusing on broadening participation in STEM for women of color. I'm honored to introduce such an accomplished scholar and activist focused on diversity and inclusion. Please help me welcome Dr. Mia Ong.
Thank you, Roseanne, for that lovely introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out on this rainy day. I want to thank Drs. Roseanne Tung, Tricia Rose, Lisa Carriagalo, Christina Downs, Caitlin Murphy, you're around here too. All of the organizers and sponsors, including the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America and the Annenberg Institute, and all the other sponsors for the opportunity to be here. I don't know if any of you know this, but this talk has been over a year in the making, I believe. So I'm very excited to finally be able to come and share my work with you. My presentation today is on my research on the experiences of intersectionality for women of color in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, and the individual and institutional strategies for their persistence and success. And first and foremost, I want to say that I'm very fortunate to work with such a fantastic, multicultural, multilingual team of researchers. I want to recognize Lily Coe, Janet Smith, and Nuria Yamo-Pascual, who are my colleagues at the Technical Education Research Centers in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our project has also included Abriel Hodari, my research partner at Eureka Scientific, and also our evaluator and colleague, Angela Johnson, who is a professor at St. Mary's College of Maryland. And so when I say we throughout this talk, this is the we I'm talking about. Today I will briefly cover a number of topics, including the motivation for my work, a short discussion of intersectionality and the double bind, a brief description of our research and methods, a few key research findings, and some advice from the women of color in STEM in our studies, and recommendations that come out of the research. Given the limitations of time, I won't be dwelling too long on any given topic, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to go into further detail during the Q&A. So first, I want to share a quote that for me illustrates the intersectionality of gender and race in the context of US STEM. The comment comes from Evelyn Hammonds, a Harvard professor who holds degrees in physics, computer science, and the history of science. In a 1986 interview, she said, "Race and gender are not separate because they aren't separate in me. I'm always black and female. I can't say, well, that was just a sexist remark, without wondering, would he have made the same sexist remark to a white woman? So does that make it a racist sexist remark? You know, I don't know, and that takes a lot of energy to be constantly trying to figure out which one it is." So in our research, we hear many sentiments that echo the energy spent on managing the effects of intersectionality. And there are many different ways to study intersectionality. For my current work, we're focused on women in the US who identify as African American or Black, Asian American, Latina, Native American, or mixed race or ethnicity. So as Roseanne mentioned, I've been doing the research on the experiences of women of color in STEM for just over 2 decades. And my work is motivated by 4 related reasons. The first 3 are research shows that policies and practices that benefit underrepresented groups like women of color tend to benefit all students. Also, an increasing amount of research has demonstrated that a diverse workforce leads to greater productivity, innovative problem solving, and transformative science. And third, women of color are identified as a valuable domestic resource, especially as the United States becomes increasingly a majority-minority nation, as more women than men enter college, it's 57% right now, and as fewer white males study STEM. Unfortunately, women of color are not yet being supported in reaching their full potential. So this is a parity chart based on recent data, 2014 data, from the US Census and the National Science Foundation. So it shows demographic representation of minority women by each race or ethnicity in the US population, which are the tan bars on the top of each group, and the science and engineering bachelor's degree recipients, the red bars. So the ideal would be for the bars to match in each group. However, you'll notice that the top 3 groups, which are, I'm sorry for the small print, American Indian or Alaska Native on the top, the group below that is Black or African American, and beneath that, Hispanic or Latina. They're severely underrepresented in science and engineering relative to their representation in the US. And for American Indian or Alaska Native women, their STEM representation is about half of their US representation. And for Black and Latina women, their STEM representation is about 40% of their respective US representations. And on the other hand, Asian and Pacific Islander women, the group at the bottom of the chart, are overrepresented in STEM relative to the representation in the US. And we've chosen to include this group in all of the work that we do because we study women throughout their careers, and Asian and Asian American women tend to stall in their STEM careers beyond entry level. And at the Ph.D. level, the situation is even more pronounced for Black and Latina women. their STEM representation is less than a third of their US representation. And for Native American women, their STEM representation remains at about half. It's a fairly dire picture. As Roseanne mentioned, I have a personal reason for being involved in STEM education, and this is the fourth and final reason I'm motivated to do this work. I really believe deeply in working towards social justice, and I believe reaching equity is the right thing to do. And I began my career in diversity and equity not as a researcher, but as a four-year director of a physics support program for women. Actually, it started out as being for historically underrepresented minorities. I included women because women are also underrepresented in physics. And that took place at the University of California at Berkeley. I loved this job. I did this job concurrent with my early graduate studies in education when I was looking for a dissertation topic. And these pictures here, this is me on the right, I look like a baby, with some of my colleagues and some of my former students. This is at a birthday party, and then at the beach after a student conference in Santa Barbara, California. And I was 25 years old, and these students called me mom. I was always nagging them, I think, to get applications done. So in this position at such a large school, I came to understand that the most important role I had, one was to learn their names and to know who they were, and two, to just listen to them. And so I listened to them, and over time I observed that the day-to-day lived experiences for students of color, and especially for women of color, were different from their male and white counterparts. And almost all the women of color who came into my office spoke of feeling alone on their educational journeys. Almost all of them talked about having experiences with classmates or faculty or both, of being told in so many words or in so many gestures or in so many ways that they were not good enough to be there. And what's more, they came to me one by one to my office to tell me their stories, and they truly believed they're the only ones who were experiencing it. And so I got to see, as a recipient of all these stories, that there was a pattern. And I said, well, somebody should be studying this, but in the mid-90s, nobody was. And so I quit that job, and I took that study on as my formal dissertation work, and I've been doing this work ever since, against the advice of my advisors at the time. So all my work has been grounded in intersectionality theory. So intersectionality theory is a concept that acknowledges that racism intersects with other oppressions in the lived experiences of people of color. And I see head nodding, so I know many of you are familiar with this concept. These other oppressions might stem from identities such as social class, religion, disability, sexuality, gender identity, among, to name a few. And certainly one individual might embody multiple identities that are oppressed. Researchers who focus on women of color, like legal scholar Deborah Way, posit that gender and race or ethnicity are intersecting oppressions that affect minorities' women's experiences to an extent that is, quote unquote, greater than the sum of racism and sexism. Intersectionality theory is rooted in second-wave feminism and critical race theory, especially in academic realms such as women's studies, ethnic studies, and legal studies. And these two books were very influential for me, Borderlands by Gloria Anzaldúa, and a compilation called This Bridge Called My Back. They're from the 1970s and early 80s and speak to the lived socio-political experiences of intersectionality for women of color. So around this time, in 1975, 1976, a black ecologist named Shirley Malcolm and her colleagues Paula Hall and Janet Brown spoke out about intersectionality and what they termed the double bind that exists for women of color in STEM. In a seminal report for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, they raised awareness about the effects of the simultaneity of sexism and racism in STEM fields. In addition, Dr. Malcolm and her colleagues raised concern that existing STEM programs intended to serve all women were in fact disproportionately benefiting white women, and programs intended to serve minorities mainly benefited minority males. So women of color often fell through the cracks and did not receive the supports and the services they needed. And while the double-blind report brought unprecedented attention to women of color in STEM, the efforts to understand their experiences and advance them through education and careers has been really few and far between in the past 40+ years. So over the past decade, I've been fortunate to receive 5 National Science Foundation grants, 4 research grants, and 1 national conference grant that have enabled a focus on the experiences of women of color in higher education and STEM careers beyond my dissertation work. Through these grants, I've been able to build a body of research that includes nearly 400 women of color, an internal and external network of scholars in the field, and we've been finding each other all over the country and all over the world, actually. As well as a network of the women themselves. Even after they participate in the study, they keep in touch with me. And I also have strong ties to federal agencies. So there are people in NSF and NIH and the White House, actually, who also support this work. So in all of my research, my team and I strive to focus on positive solutions. To that end, our primary research question is, what strategies enable women of color to achieve higher levels of advancement in STEM, higher education, and professions? And we gather mainly qualitative data in the form of written texts, individual interviews, and ethnographies of successful higher education programs. And specifically, we collect stories because we subscribe to the tenet of critical race theory that argues for a focus on counter-storytelling, which empowers marginalized individuals to share their experiences and their own voices. So we also focus on 4 fields where women of color are most underrepresented: physics, astrophysics, and astronomy, computer science, and engineering. And there are actually 4 subfields of engineering that I can talk to you about. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to share all of my findings, but I will focus on some of our current findings which really focus on STEM education, and we'll be publishing them later this year. In our work, we found that women of color students experience isolation and microaggressions. And one way they persist in STEM, despite those, is to participate in Counterspaces. And I'll explain Counterspaces in a moment. Across 2 of our recent studies, we found that 77% of participants reported experiences of isolation, 68 reported instances of microaggressions, and 92% reported participating in Counterspaces. So when you hear the stories I'll be reading in a few moments, please know that it's within this larger context and that the stories are representative of many, many others that we have heard. So isolation happens in at least 3 ways. Women of color feel hypervisible, meaning they stand out in their classrooms, in their hallways, in their departments, and they feel pressure to be the representative of their race or gender or both. And ironically, they simultaneously feel invisible, such as not being acknowledged by others when passed in the hallway or when they raise their hand in class. And a third form of isolation is more numerical, where there is a conspicuous lack of others like them in their departments or their schools. So, for example, a black professional in engineering, we call her Ayana, these are all pseudonyms, recalled how she was one of a few black women in her undergraduate program in engineering, and yet she was rarely acknowledged. She said, "I feel very marginalized and ignored. I felt very marginalized and ignored. You know, we have 5 classes together, yet I see you in the hallway and you look through me. That's very disconcerting. I was one of 3 black women in the entire department of 900 students, and yet people somehow couldn't see me. I had to stand out. There's no way I'm not standing out." And in a similar vein, an Asian American woman we call Serena, who is now a computer science educator, spoke about the pressure she felt to represent her kind in her computing undergraduate classes. Walking into lecture halls with like 400 people, feeling the severe lack of representation of people who look like you. It's uncomfortable and you know that you're being noticed. And you have to be careful what questions you ask or how you proceed because you understand that people see you as this representative of either your gender or your race. So Serena went on to say that in her entire undergraduate career, she did not have any female instructors and only one minority male instructor. And it's not coincidental that now in her work as an educator, she's deeply dedicated to increasing diversity in computer science education and professions. So moving on to microaggressions, sociologists Daniel Solorzano, Tara Yasso, and their colleagues define individual microaggressions as subtle insults directed toward people of color, often unconsciously or unintentionally. They define institutional microaggressions as marginalizing actions and inertia of the university that may be found within structures and practices that endorse a campus climate hostile to members of underrepresented groups. So an example they give of institutional microaggression is a university that displays only European art in public campus spaces. So in our work, here are some examples of individual microaggressions that emerged from, and those include women of color reporting. We get this a lot. Peers consistently excluding them from study groups. Peers and faculty expressing doubts about their capabilities or making negative remarks about their race or gender. And as brief examples of institutional microaggressions, one participant described walking into a professor's office hours and seeing a large Confederate flag draped on the wall behind his desk. More common and subtler examples include our participants reporting, they walk through the hallways of their STEM departments and they see nothing but photos of white and Asian male scientists. Another example that's fairly common is professors or others with institutional authority being aware of racial or gendered offenses occurring but doing nothing about it. So it's inaction. So to illustrate the subtlety and potential consequence of an everyday microaggression, there is a recounting by Zena, a Latina senior in computer science, describing a conversation she had with a new friend right after both of them just started college. So 2 or 3 weeks into my first year of college, I was talking to a new friend. We were just talking about our SAT scores and all this other stuff, very academic based. And they were just like, probably the fact that you are a woman of color, because you're Mexican, you got in. So it's like affirmative action was in your favor. So this is a very, very common scenario for underrepresented students, especially those at competitive, predominantly white institutions. And the exchange probably lasted about a few seconds, but for Zena, the effects were long lasting. And she goes on to say, that really hit my self-confidence academically because I didn't know whether it was because I got a good grade, good SAT score, and really good grades. I got a 4.0 GPA, and I still to this day don't know if I got in because of that 4.0 or because I was the 4.0 that was Mexican. So that's just something that keeps digging at me. So according to this account, this peer, despite knowing Zena's strong pre-college grades and SAT scores, voiced the assumption that Zena had benefited from affirmative action. Zena expressed an understanding that the peer, a supposed friend, was directing a microaggression toward her. And more specifically, it's what sociologists call a micro-insult, which is a racialized insult masquerading as a compliment. So nevertheless, Zena began to doubt the legitimacy of her presence in college, and the doubts kept digging at her and continued 3 years later to undermine her confidence and sense of belonging in computing. So in our work, we've identified counterspaces as potential antidotes to isolation and microaggressions. And we're certainly not the first to study counterspaces or what others refer to as safe spaces or safe havens, but we're among the first researchers to systematically analyze them analyze the use of counterspaces in STEM for marginalized groups like women of color. Solorzano and his colleagues identify counterspaces as spaces where marginalized students can be validated as academic scholars, where they can vent their frustrations about racism and sexism, and perhaps share strategies for dealing with them, and where their academic identities can develop alongside positive racial climates. Additionally, we have come to understand that counterspaces can be formal or informal spaces, and they can be physical, ideological, or both. And in our work, we've identified counterspaces appearing in multiple places: in relationships, support groups and student groups, diversity conferences, and what was surprising to us, in mainstream STEM departments. And this is what we've come to call institutional or departmental counterspaces. And for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the last two types of counterspaces and how they've operated for the women of color in our study. Excuse me. I'll share 3 mini counter stories from a participant we call Chloe, a woman who identified as mixed race and who at the time of our interview had just received her Ph.D. in physics. Chloe spoke about the first time she, as an undergraduate, attended a diversity conference sponsored by the National Society of Black Physicists. And she relayed the experience of being able to bring together her academic and racial identities when she said, "I went and saw all these talks about cosmology and relativity, and I was super excited about them, and I had never seen black people talking about that stuff before. The National Society of Black Physicists was a safe space where I can actually be a person of color and be a physicist at the same time and not have anyone question my commitment to either identity." Chloe also underscored the importance of finding mentors at this conference whose experiences resonated with her own. And she went on to say, "I think the powerful thing about the NSBP community is that everybody has a story about being told, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough. It happened to every single black physicist I've run into, especially people who went to predominantly white majority institutions." So equally important, I think, to sharing the similar stories is the fact that these senior mentors remained in physics and therefore were able to serve as role models for persistence for Chloe and others like her. So now I want to share another example of a conference with something of a twist. So I was hired about a year ago as an external evaluator for an entrepreneurship conference. And this conference was not explicitly labeled as a STEM diversity conference, but the organizers created and widely distributed a flyer with this panel of speakers, all of whom had STEM backgrounds and were very successful entrepreneurs. So the organizers emailed invitations to all 1,000 STEM graduate students at the university, regardless of race or ethnicity. And on the day of the conference, only 44 students total attended. And certainly some of the low attendance could be attributed to the fact of poor timing. It took place near the end of the semester. But 42 of those students were members of historically underrepresented groups, and 2 were majority students. During the conference, all the speakers gave great advice that any student could benefit from, such as how to develop an idea into a commercial product, angel investors versus federal grants, the importance of communication skills, and the like. They also told deeply personal stories of challenges and how they overcame them. And during a break, when I asked a Latina engineering graduate student, "What have you learned today so far?" she pointed towards the speakers and said that they exist, entrepreneurs who are brown and black, who are so successful but are willing to come talk to us. And when I asked her what that meant to her, she said, "I have potential mentors. I know I can go talk to them." And so the day was very rewarding for her and others like her. But the twist is the feedback that organizers received following the conference from their white majority students who were not there. And when organizers asked why they didn't attend, several of these students answered, "Oh, I got the invitation, but I didn't think it was for me." Or, "I wasn't sure I'd feel comfortable." And And this surprised the main organizer especially. One of the black STEM professors who was part of the conference spoke to his students and answered them, well, welcome to my world. This is how I always feel. And I think what this professor did was engage a teachable moment with his majority students, what philosopher Terry Elliott calls making strange what appeared familiar. And if you were sent a flyer with this image, what message might you read? And given the day-to-day images they encounter in their STEM departments, what messages do women, underrepresented minorities, and women of color read about their representation, belonging, comfort, inclusion? And I would argue that all of this speaks to institutional microaggressions and institutional counterspaces. The lead organizer, who is a white female STEM professor and who by all accounts is highly regarded, who deeply cares about inclusion, has been in conversation with me quite a lot. And we're working together to reflect on all the feedback and to work towards making future conferences more inclusive for everybody. So going back to Chloe, I want to talk now about her encounter with an institutional counterspace. Chloe talked about how her department in graduate school served as a safe haven through its practices of zero tolerance for racism. So she reflected, I think it was very clear in my graduate department, in that community, that racism is just not acceptable. I think that if departments are serious about being welcoming environments, then they have to be very vocal about having absolutely zero tolerance policies for harassment. So I think that my department really set a different cultural standard for what was okay. And it made the environment a lot more fun. And she went on to give an example that racist jokes, even said in a kidding manner, were squashed. They were dealt with very severely. Even one of her best friends who made a funny comment was pulled inside an office and told that was just not okay. And to us as researchers, it's key that Chloe draws a direct line between a zero tolerance policy and a fun environment of her physics department. And I've studied STEM departments and physics departments for many years, and not a lot of people describe their physics departments as fun. So to us, this is key, and I think there's something to be learned here. Another way that STEM departments can be counterspaces is by supporting educational and professional work that closes potential gaps between cultural and STEM worlds. My research and the work of many others, including Angela Johnson and Heidi Carloni, suggests that this is a key retention strategy. So for example, in my current study, there's a mixed race first-generation graduate student in engineering. We call her Valencia. And she spoke emphatically about the importance of being able to close the gap between her home life and her school life. And she did this by proposing to her faculty committee to do a thesis topic on soil ecology, which is her field, and to include ancient and current Native American practices in that. And her committee agreed. And she talks here about the anxiety she was feeling. She says, basically, school is where I want to be. Home is where I come from. And I was so scared because I felt like the further I go in education, the larger this gap gets. And mind you, she was being told constantly by her family, come home, work. We need you to work. We need you to bring income into the family. And so she was being pulled. And she was also feeling that she was having less and less in common with her family members. So when she was able to pull this thesis together, she goes on to say, I think having my thesis topic the way it is, with it being interdisciplinary, has been the bridge between my cultural, personal life and what is expected from my department. And so being able to share that part of who I am, because it is part of my thesis, I have to share that with my colleagues, my peers, my professors, and see that they can get interested in it too. So my research team and I are excited about the prospect of introducing the concept of institutional or departmental counterspaces, because these counterspaces are actually in the heart of the STEM departments instead of being at the margins where they're usually found. And so I hope you'll be able to help me think about what other aspects of departmental counterspaces are taking place here, or what's being planned and how they're being enacted. Yes.
Can you share what was her thesis?
I'm sorry? Her thesis topic? I can't be too specific because it's going to be very, but we are calling it soil ecology as a general term, and she's an engineer. So before I conclude with recommendations, I just want to share some of the advice to institutions that come straight from women of color across our studies. One of the last questions we ask in every interview is, what advice would you have for institutions to increase retention of women of color in STEM? And here's just a small but representative sample of answers. So many of our participants, like Lexi, who's a graduate student in computing, really wanted institutions and departments to pay attention to the climate that they were producing. And I love the way she words it here. And she says, don't be afraid to be a little more proactive as far as understanding and hearing about how people of color, minorities in general, feel in terms of the environment you're producing. Like, I mean, you probably shouldn't wait until someone comes to you and complains, because a lot of minorities don't complain. They don't say anything. They either just deal with it or they leave. So ask people, poll or whatever, surveys to see what's working and what's not. And I was glad, I was reading some of the Brown Diversity and Inclusion Action Plans, and I was glad to see that there are some climate surveys that are taking place here on this campus in the STEM departments. Other women of color in our study believe that institutions and departments would benefit from having open discussions about diversity and inclusion, particularly with the assistance of experts on this topic. So for example, Yvette, an African-American engineering faculty member, said, have some mechanism for open and honest discussion of these diversity problems. More than likely, you're going to have to bring in people who have expertise, who have studied this, who can be a neutral party, and who can work with this. Now that's automatically a barrier because a lot of people will say, I'm not going to some sensitivity training. But I don't know, give it a different name and offer them free food. But do something where, if we could all be big enough, so to speak, to admit both our good and our bad, well that would change the world. And finally, in a similar vein, a number of interviews wanted to advise institutions to guard against implicit biases, and I know this is a very common topic, but I think the way Serena talks about it is she's thinking about how to retain professionals who are women of color. And she says, I think a really critical look at the way promotion and reviews are handled is important, because it's really important that the people on both ends, the managers, are very well trained and very systematic and don't allow their unconscious biases to come into play when they're writing reviews. So I'll conclude with some recommendations which are drawn from the research that I just presented. Set, publicize, and enforce zero-tolerance policies against discrimination. Provide funding for students, faculty, and leaders to attend STEM diversity conferences. Be aware of and help prevent individual and institutional microaggressions. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think efforts ought to be made. Build and maintain Counterspaces in your departments. Bring in diversity expertise to conduct anti-bias workshops and cultural competency workshops. Take a climate survey, what's working, what's not, and then host discussions on inclusion. And finally, have mechanisms in place to guard against bias. And again, I know Brown is already addressing many of these actions, but I want to invite you in identifying even more local solutions. So I end with a question. How can you begin to change the STEM culture at your institution tomorrow? And I want to thank my team again and my sponsors and say thank you.